Ooh, I feel this one already stirring in my spirit. Because somebody in this room has been thinking yourself into a panic, talking yourself out of purpose, and convincing yourself that maybe God forgot about you. But baby, I came to remind you tonight, God didn't forget. You've just been overthinking what he's already settled. You've been rehearsing the problem when God has already written the promise. And I know it's hard to let go when your mind keeps running wild. It's hard to trust when everything feels uncertain. But let me tell you this. The same God who spoke light into darkness, the same God who parted the Red Sea, the same God who raised Jesus from the grave is about to do the impossible for you. So stop pacing, stop doubting, stop replaying what you can't control. God doesn't need your logic. He needs your surrender. He doesn't need your plan. He needs your faith. Because when you stop overthinking, you make room for God to overflow. There's a moment in every believer's journey when God asks you to move, but your mind tells you to wait. It's that internal tug of war between what God said and what your logic is trying to reason through. You hear his voice say, go, but your mind says, how? You feel him nudging you to trust, but your anxiety whispers, what if it fails? And that's where many of us get stuck, not because we don't love God, not because we don't believe he's powerful, but because our minds have become the battlefield that blocks our obedience. Overthinking is not harmless. It's disobedience dressed up in logic. It's fear wearing the mask of wisdom. See, when you overthink, you start worshiping the problem instead of the promise. You replay every worst case scenario, every detail, every possibility until your spirit gets drowned by your thoughts. And you wonder why you can't move forward. It's because you've made an idol out of understanding. You've told yourself that peace will come when you figure it out. But God never called you to figure it out. He called you to follow him. Abraham didn't know where he was going. Moses didn't know how the Red Sea would part. Mary didn't know how she, a virgin, could give birth to the Savior. But what they did know was this. If God said it, obedience would unlock it. And yet here we are, trying to micromanage miracles with human logic. We want divine results without divine trust. We want to see the blueprint before we take the first step, but obedience doesn't work that way. You can't overthink your way into destiny. You can only obey your way into it. Some of you have been praying for breakthrough, but your breakthrough is sitting on the other side of your hesitation. You've been asking God to open doors, but he's waiting for you to walk through the one that's already unlocked. You've been asking for confirmation, but deep down you already know what he said. Overthinking has you stuck between revelation and realization. God revealed it, but you won't move to realize it. Let's be honest, overthinking feels safe. It feels like control. It gives you the illusion that if you can analyze every possibility, you can somehow protect yourself from pain. But all it really does is rob you of peace and delay your purpose. Because when you overthink, you aren't just second guessing yourself, you're second guessing God. You're saying, Lord, I hear you, but let me double check the map. You're saying, God, I know you said you'd make a way, but I need to see the map first. And every time you do that, your obedience gets weaker, your faith gets smaller, and your anxiety grows louder. Obedience requires trust, and trust requires surrender. You can't surrender what you're still analyzing. You can't step out in faith while still trying to calculate the outcome. Faith says, even if I don't see it, I believe it. Faith says, even if I don't understand it, I'll still move. And I know that's not easy because some of us have been taught to survive through control. Control made us feel safe when people failed us. Control made us feel powerful when life felt uncertain. So we think if we can just overthink it, maybe we can avoid another disappointment. But here's the truth. Overthinking doesn't prevent pain, it prolongs it. Because while you're trying to protect yourself, you're missing out on the very thing that could heal you. God doesn't need you to understand every detail. He needs you to take the next step. He's not asking for your strategy. He's asking for your yes. Your obedience is the seed for the miracle you've been praying for. And sometimes that obedience looks like doing it afraid. Sometimes it looks like trusting even when your mind is screaming, what if it doesn't work? Sometimes it looks like walking away from what's familiar so you can step into what's promised. There's a story in the Bible that illustrates this so beautifully. When Peter saw Jesus walking on water, Peter said, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to come." And Jesus said one word, "Come." Now imagine Peter's mind in that moment. The wind is blowing, the waves are crashing, logic is screaming, you can't walk on water. But something inside of him, faith, said, if Jesus said come, then water will have to hold me. But here's what gets me. Peter didn't walk on water because he was skilled. He walked because he was obedient. The moment he started overthinking, he began to sink. That's what overthinking does. It sinks you in situations where you were meant to soar. Overthinking will drown your faith in the sea of your own reasoning. It will keep you bound to what's safe while God is calling you to what's supernatural. God never intended for you to live bound by what ifs. He called you to live anchored in even if. Even if it doesn't go the way I plan, I'll still trust you. Even if I don't have all the answers, I'll still obey. Even if I don't see how it's going to work out, I'll still move forward. Some of you have been circling the same mountain of indecision for years. You've prayed about it, journaled about it, fasted about it, but you haven't moved on it. And you call it waiting on God, but really God is waiting on you. Waiting on you to stop overthinking and start obeying. Waiting on you to silence your doubts and step out in faith. Because every time you delay obedience, you delay destiny. Every time you hesitate, you hand your fear more power than your faith. You can't keep asking God to do the impossible while you're still clinging to what's comfortable. The miracle you're waiting for will not happen in the safety of overthinking. It happens in the motion of obedience. It's in the step you're afraid to take. It's in the yes you've been withholding. It's in the release of your need to control. Let me tell you something, your mind is brilliant, but it makes a terrible master. When you let your thoughts lead you instead of your spirit, you'll always end up anxious, always end up weary, always end up doubting, because the mind wants certainty, but faith thrives in mystery. The mind wants to understand, but faith wants to trust. So the longer you live in your head, the less you experience what God can do in your life. And listen, this isn't to shame you, this is to wake you up. Because God has placed something inside of you, an assignment, a vision, a calling, and it's too big for you to overthink it into paralysis. You've been asking God when, and he's been saying when you move. You've been waiting for peace before you act, but peace doesn't always come before obedience. Sometimes peace follows obedience. It's time to break that cycle. It's time to recognize that your overthinking is not a personality trait. It's a spiritual stronghold. It's the enemy whispering, you're not ready. You'll mess it up. What if you fail? And you've been agreeing with him by staying still. But the moment you stop agreeing with fear, the moment you decide to trust God more than your thoughts, that's when you'll start to see movement. That's when heaven responds. Because God honors obedience, not overanalysis. And maybe you're saying, but Sarah, I just don't know what to do. Let me tell you, when you don't know what to do, do the last thing God told you. Go back to that instruction you've been ignoring because it didn't make sense. Go back to that yes you gave up on because the timeline didn't match your expectations. Because sometimes your obedience will feel like foolishness before it looks like faith. Sometimes what God asks you to do won't make sense until you see the miracle unfold. Overthinking keeps you stuck in delay disguised as discernment. But discernment without obedience is just disobedience in disguise. You can't keep asking God for signs when he's already given you his word. You can't keep asking for confirmation when the conviction is already in your spirit. God doesn't need you to know how it's going to happen. He just needs you to believe that it will. So this is your moment to shift, to stop letting your thoughts bully your obedience, to tell your mind, you don't get to run me anymore. To remind yourself that your faith was built for uncertainty, that your obedience is your offering, and that when you trust God with a step, He'll handle the outcome. Because you can't overthink your way into peace. You can only obey your way into it. And I know it might feel risky. It might feel uncomfortable, but that's how you know it's faith. Faith never feels safe. It feels sacred. It feels like walking on water, like stepping into the unknown, like surrendering the steering wheel and saying, God, I trust you. Because when you finally stop overthinking, when you finally quiet your thoughts long enough to hear His voice clearly again, you'll realize that the miracle you've been waiting for wasn't waiting on heaven, it was waiting on your obedience. Faith and control can't coexist. You can't say, God, I trust you, while still gripping the wheel, still mapping the route, still trying to predict every turn. You can't walk by faith and cling to control at the same time, because faith requires letting go. It's the surrender that says, God, even if it doesn't look like what I expected, I'll still trust you. Control says, I need to know, but faith says, I believe even when I don't. Control says, I'll do it my way, but faith says, not my will, but yours be done. And that tension between the two, that's where so many of us live. We say we want God to move, but we won't release our grip long enough for Him to take over. You see, control feels safe. It feels like protection. Because somewhere in your story, you learn that if you could just manage everything, maybe you wouldn't get hurt again. Maybe if you plan every detail, maybe if you prepare for every outcome, you can prevent disappointment. But control doesn't protect you, it imprisons you. It traps you in a cycle of anxiety, exhaustion, and fear, because you're trying to play God in situations you were never designed to handle alone. There's a deep truth you have to understand. Control is rooted in fear, but faith is rooted in trust. Fear says, what if it doesn't work? Faith says, even if it doesn't, God is still good. Fear says, I can't let go. Faith says, if I let go, I'll finally be free. Because control gives you the illusion of peace, but it never delivers real peace. You're calm as long as things go according to plan, but the moment something shifts, you spiral. That's not peace, that's performance. Real peace isn't the absence of chaos, it's the presence of trust. When God tells you to trust Him, He's not asking you to throw away wisdom. He's asking you to throw away worry. He's asking you to believe that He's capable of leading you, even when you can't see where He's taking you. Faith doesn't require perfect clarity. It requires consistent surrender. Every day choosing to say, God, you lead. I'll follow. Even when your emotions are screaming, even when your plans are falling apart, even when you can't understand the why. There's a story in 2 Kings about a man named Naaman. Naaman was a warrior, a leader, respected and powerful, but he had leprosy. And when the prophet Elisha told him to dip 7 times in the Jordan River to be healed, Naaman got offended because the instruction didn't fit his idea of how a miracle should happen. He wanted control. He wanted something grand, something logical, but healing required humility. The miracle wasn't in his might, it was in his obedience. And the same is true for us. Sometimes God's instructions won't make sense because He's trying to break the grip of control that's been strangling your faith. He'll give you directions that confuse your logic so He can build your trust. Control is subtle. It hides behind phrases like, I just want to be prepared, or I'm just being careful. But often it's not preparation, it's fear disguised as wisdom. It's you saying, I trust God, while secretly trying to create a backup plan in case He doesn't come through. But God doesn't need your backup plan. He needs your full surrender. Because as long as you have a plan B, you'll never give yourself fully to plan A. And God can't bless what you're holding back. Sometimes God will allow you to come to the end of yourself just to show you that he's still God without your control. He'll let your plans crumble so that you can see his power clearly. Because as long as you're in control, you'll never experience the fullness of what it means to trust him completely. That's why faith and control can't coexist. Because control keeps you in charge and faith keeps God in charge. Think about Peter in the boat again. As long as he stayed in control, he was safe but stagnant. It wasn't until he stepped out, until he relinquished control, that he experienced the supernatural. He didn't walk on water because he understood how. He walked because he trusted who called him. Faith will always feel risky to a person addicted to control. But that risk is where miracles live. That space between I can't and God can is where faith breathes. When you cling to control, you miss the beauty of surrender. You miss the peace that comes from saying, God, I can't fix it, but I know you can. You miss the divine flow that happens when you stop striving and start resting, because control makes you carry weights you were never built to bear. You end up anxious, sleepless, tense, trying to hold the world together when God already promised he would sustain you. Sometimes you don't realize how heavy control is until you finally let it go, until you stop managing outcomes, stop manipulating people, stop worrying about what's next, and just breathe. When you release control, you make space for God to move. Because while you're holding on, God waits. But the moment you release it, he steps in. That's why it feels like everything shifts when you finally surrender. It's because you've removed the barrier that was blocking his hand. And let's be real, surrender isn't easy. It's scary to let go of something you've used to survive. For some of you, control has been your coping mechanism. It's been your way of avoiding disappointment, your way of protecting your heart. But God is saying, I can't heal what you're still hiding behind control. He wants to show you that his hands are stronger than yours. He wants to show you that when you release what you can't fix, he'll do what only he can do. Think about the widow in 1 Kings 17. She had one last meal left, just enough for her and her son before they died. Control said, keep it, protect what's left. But faith said, give it to the prophet. And when she let go of what she thought would run out, God multiplied it. That's what happens when you surrender. You discover that what you release in faith, God increases in favor. But as long as you're trying to control, you're cutting off the flow of what he wants to do through you. Control is often rooted in trauma. Somewhere life taught you that being out of control meant being unsafe. Maybe people failed you. Maybe situations blindsided you. So now control feels like safety. But God is not like the people who hurt you. His plans won't harm you. His delays aren't denials. His not yet isn't punishment. It's preparation. But you won't see that if you keep holding the pen while he's trying to write your story. Sometimes God will wait until your hands are empty before he places the next blessing, because full hands can't receive new things. We serve a God who works best in surrendered spaces. When you stop trying to make everything happen in your own strength, he begins to move in supernatural ways. But you can't experience that while you're still clinging to your plans, your timing, your expectations. The need to control is what keeps many of us from fully walking in purpose, because purpose requires faith and faith requires flow. Control kills flow. Control stops movement. Control says, I'll wait until I understand. But purpose says, move while you trust. The reason it's so exhausting to control everything is because it's unnatural. You weren't created to carry that kind of pressure. You were created to depend, to lean, to trust. But the world taught you independence to the point of isolation, to the point of anxiety. And now you call it strength, but it's really survival. You call it wisdom, but it's really fear. God is calling you out of that. He's calling you into rest, not laziness, but trust. The kind of rest that says, God, I've done what I can. Now you do what I can. Faith and control will always be in conflict because they have two different centers. Control makes you the center. Faith makes God the center. Control says, I'm responsible for the outcome. Faith says, I'm responsible for obedience. You can't be both the driver and the passenger in your destiny. You have to decide whether you want the illusion of safety or the reality of surrender. Because every miracle recorded in Scripture came through surrender, not control. When Mary said yes to carrying Jesus, she wasn't in control of how it would look, how people would perceive her, or how it would unfold. But her surrender birthed salvation. When Abraham lifted the knife over Isaac, he wasn't in control of the outcome. But his obedience opened the door to a divine provision, a ram in the bush. When Jesus went to the cross, he wasn't controlling the pain. He was surrendering to purpose, and that surrender became our salvation. You have to understand that surrender doesn't mean passivity. It means positioning. It means aligning yourself under God's authority so he can lead you into what he promised. It's saying, God, I don't have to control it because I trust you to handle it. The moment you stop fighting for control, you start flowing in grace, because grace works where striving stops. Maybe right now your life feels like chaos because you're between control and faith. You want to trust God, but part of you is still clinging to the plan. You're saying, God, I trust you, but your mind is still trying to calculate the next step. That's the tension of transformation. That's where God begins to stretch you. Because he's teaching you that faith isn't about having the answers, it's about knowing the answer. Believing that he's faithful even when you can't predict what's next. Every time you surrender control, your faith grows. Every time you let go, God reveals another layer of his faithfulness. You start to see that he's not just a provider, he's also a sustainer. That he doesn't just bless you, he keeps you. And soon you realize that what you were trying so hard to control was never meant to be controlled. It was meant to be trusted. You can't walk into the impossible while clinging to the illusion of control. The impossible requires faith, and faith requires freedom. Freedom from needing to know, needing to understand, needing to manage. You can't overthink your way into miracles. You can't control your way into blessings, but you can trust your way into overflow. Because when you release control, you make room for the supernatural to flow through your life in ways your plans could never produce. Sometimes the hardest prayer you'll ever pray is, God, I trust you anyway. When the job falls through, when the relationship doesn't work, when the dream feels delayed, that's when control wants to rise. That's when you want to fix it, explain it, change it. But that's also when God is whispering, be still and know that I am God. Not you, not them, I am God, and I can handle what you can't. I can see what you don't. I can work where you can't reach. Control says, if I let go, I'll lose. Faith says, if I let go, I'll live. Because the truth is, you're not losing anything when you surrender. You're gaining peace, clarity, and divine partnership. You're trading exhaustion for alignment. You're trading striving for stillness. And when you reach that point where you say, God, I don't need to know how, I just need to know you, that's when real faith begins to ride. Faith and control can't coexist because one of them has to bow. Either your need to control will bow to your faith, or your faith will bow to your need to control. And the one that wins determines how far you'll go with God. Because God won't compete with your control. He'll wait, he'll let you run in circles until you finally realize that your control was never keeping you safe, it was keeping you stuck. And when you finally release it, you'll find out that he was ready all along to do the impossible in your life. The impossible happens when you release it. The moment you take your hands off what you've been trying to fix, control, or force, That's when God steps in. The impossible doesn't move through striving, it flows through surrender. And some of you have been holding on to something so tightly that you've strangled your own miracle. You've been praying, crying, fasting, asking God to move, but you haven't released it yet. You haven't placed it in his hands and left it there. You've given it to him in prayer, but then you took it right back in worry. You said, Lord, I trust you, but then you lost sleep trying to figure it out. And God is saying tonight, I can't do the impossible while you're still managing the possible. You see, we serve a God who specializes in impossible situations, but he doesn't move where there's no faith. He doesn't operate in spaces filled with fear and control. He moves where there's surrender. The impossible begins when your strength ends. It starts when you reach that place where you say, God, I've done all I can do. Now it's in your hands. Because as long as you're still working to fix it your way, you'll never see him do it his way. Let's think about the story of Lazarus. When Jesus came to Bethany, Lazarus had been dead 4 days. Martha and Mary were grieving, frustrated, disappointed because they believed that if Jesus had come earlier, their brother wouldn't have died. They were focused on what seemed impossible, death. But Jesus wasn't late. He was setting the stage for the miraculous. He said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? And then he told them to roll away the stone. That was their act of release. That was them taking their hands off what they had already accepted as over. And it was in that moment of release that resurrection happened. The impossible always requires a release. The release of your logic, your timeline, your expectation, your understanding, because miracles don't live in your management, they live in God's movement. Sometimes God will wait until you release it so that there is no confusion about who deserves the glory when it happens. He'll let your resources run out, your plans collapse, your strength fade. So when he performs the miracle, you'll know it was him. But releasing isn't passive, it's powerful. It's not giving up, it's giving over. It's saying, God, I trust you more than I trust my plan. And that's where so many of us struggle. We say we believe in miracles, but we still try to control the method. We pray for God to move, but we hand him instructions on how to do it. And he's saying, I don't need your directions, I need your faith. Because the impossible can't manifest through your control, it manifests through your surrender. Some of you are carrying situations right now that are too heavy because they were never meant to be carried by human hands. You've been trying to carry what only God can hold. You've been trying to fix what only God can heal. And that's why you're exhausted, not because you're weak, but because you're doing a divine job with human strength. When you release it, you're not quitting, you're aligning. You're saying, God, this is too big for me, but it's just right for you. The widow with the oil and 2 kings had nothing left but a little jar of oil. The prophet told her to pour it out, to release it. Now, in her mind, that didn't make sense. How do you pour when there's barely anything left? But the moment she started pouring, the oil began to multiply. It didn't multiply while she was holding it. It multiplied when she released it. And that's what happens when you released it to God. The little you have becomes more than enough. The situation you thought was over begins to overflow. Releasing doesn't always mean walking away. It means trusting the outcome. It means being able to say, God, if you do it, I'll praise you. And if you don't, I'll still praise you. That's the posture of a surrendered heart. Because when your faith is rooted in who God is and not what he does, you can live in peace even when the outcome isn't what you expected. Some of you have been fighting for control because you don't trust what will happen if you let go. But what if letting go is the very thing that unlocks what you've been praying for? What if the release is the key? Sometimes the weight you feel isn't the problem, it's your grip on it. And the moment you release it, the weight lifts, because you were never meant to carry what you've been trying to control. We talk about faith like it's easy, but faith is costly. It costs you your comfort, your pride, your certainty. It costs you your plan. And yet that's the price for seeing the impossible. The woman with the issue of blood had to release her fear of rejection to reach out for Jesus. The blind man had to release his shame to cry out for healing. The disciples had to release their nets, their livelihood, to follow him. Every miracle in Scripture required someone to release something. We think miracles happen because God moves, but often they happen because someone released fear, released control, released pride, released what they thought they needed, because when you release it, you create space for God to move. And that space, where you've stopped striving and started trusting, is where heaven invades earth. There's a moment in every person's journey with God where he asks for the very thing you don't want to give up. Not because he wants to take it from you, but because he wants to show you that he's greater than it. Abraham faced that moment when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac, the promised child, the miracle he had waited for, the one thing that represented everything God had ever spoken to him. And yet Abraham didn't hesitate. He didn't argue. He released it, and right when he lifted the knife, God provided a ram. You see, God wasn't after Isaac. He was after Abraham's heart. He wanted to know if Abraham trusted the promise more than the provider. That's what release really is, trusting the provider more than the promise. Trusting God's heart even when you can't trace his hand, because the impossible doesn't happen when you control. It happens when you trust. And that trust has to be louder than your fear. It has to be deeper than your disappointment. It has to be stronger than your timeline. Sometimes releasing means forgiving someone who hurt you deeply, because as long as you hold on to that pain, you block the healing God wants to release in your life. The impossible miracle of peace can't reach a heart that's still gripping bitterness. And I know it's hard. It feels unfair to release what they did. But forgiveness isn't saying it was okay. It's saying, I'm not letting this hold me anymore. When you release it, you free yourself. Sometimes releasing means walking away from something that feels comfortable but isn't God ordained. That relationship, that job, that habit feels familiar, but it's holding you back. You're praying for God to open a door, but you're still standing in front of one he already closed. You're asking for new blessings, but your hands are full of old burdens. God can't feel what's still clenched. Release it. Let go of what's comfortable so he can give you what's called. The impossible happens when you release it, because God can't bless what you won't bring. The boy with the 5 loaves and 2 fish brought his little lunch to Jesus. That was all he had. It wasn't enough to feed a crowd of thousands, but he released it anyway. And the moment it left his hands and entered Jesus's hands, multiplication began. That's the power of release. What's not enough in your hands becomes more than enough in God's hands. You keep saying, God, I need a miracle, but miracles require movement. They require release. They require you to stop trying to figure it out and start trusting it out. Because faith is not about knowing how it will happen. It's about believing it will. The woman who anointed Jesus with oil didn't wait for permission. She didn't calculate how it would look. She broke the alabaster box and poured it out. That was her release. That was her worship. And in her release, she experienced something eternal. Sometimes your release isn't a physical act. It's an internal shift. It's releasing anxiety, releasing doubt, releasing the need to be strong all the time. Some of you have been so busy being the strong one, the one who holds it together for everyone else, that you've forgotten how to rest. You've forgotten how to trust. You've been functioning from fear instead of flowing from faith. And God is saying, release it. You don't have to carry that anymore. You don't have to pretend. You don't have to perform. You just have to rest in me. When you release it, you return the weight of your life back to the one who designed it. You say, God, you know the plans. You know the timing. You know what's best. And when you do that, something supernatural begins to happen. Peace enters, doors open, strength rises, because God moves where he's trusted. He moves where there's room. There's power in empty hands, because empty hands can receive, empty hands can worship, empty hands can reach. You think release means losing, but in the kingdom, release means gain. Jesus said, whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. That means when you release your will, your time, and your control, you actually find yourself in the center of God's purpose. The reason the impossible hasn't happened yet isn't because God can't do it, it's because you haven't released it. You're still carrying what he told you to cast. You're still managing what he told you to surrender. You're still holding the outcome hostage when he's trying to bring you into overflow. The miracle is ready, heaven is ready, but your release is the key that unlocks it. And maybe you're afraid because releasing feels uncertain. But let me tell you, what feels uncertain to you is already settled to God. He's not scrambling. He's not surprised. He's not behind schedule. He's just waiting for your surrender. The moment you say, God, I'm done trying to control it, you'll see doors open that logic can't explain. You'll see healing flow where doctors said it was impossible. You'll see provision appear where resources ran out. Because the impossible doesn't respond to your plans, it responds to your faith. Releasing requires courage. It requires trust. It requires you to believe that even if it doesn't happen the way you imagine, it will still work together for your good. You have to trust that God sees the full picture when you only see a piece. And that trust is what positions you for miracles. Because faith doesn't just believe that God can, it believes that he will. When you release it, you shift the weight of responsibility from yourself to God. You stop trying to make it happen and start watching him make it beautiful. You stop striving and start soaring. You stop fixing and start flowing, because God doesn't need your stress. He needs your surrender. He doesn't respond to panic. He responds to faith. And sometimes the release will come through worship. When you lift your hands, you're physically showing God that you're letting go. You're saying, this is too much for me, but not too much for you. That act of worship opens the atmosphere for miracles, because worship is a form of release. It shifts the focus from your problem to your provider. Think about the Israelites at the Red Sea. The Egyptians were behind them, the sea was in front of them, and fear was closing in. They didn't know what to do, but God told Moses, stretch out your hand. That's a picture of release. Moses lifted what he had, the staff, and God did the rest. The waters parted, the impossible became possible, but it didn't happen until Moses released what was in his hand. That's what God is asking you to do. Release what's in your hand so he can release what's in his. You're holding on to something small while he's trying to give you something great. You're clinging to survival when he's calling you to abundance. You're holding on to the past when he's preparing your future. But you can't receive what's next if you're still gripping what was. You release it, you declare that God is greater than your grip. You declare that his ways are higher, his timing is perfect, and his plan is better. You stop wrestling with what you can't change and start resting in what he's promised. Because the impossible happens not when you understand everything, but when you trust despite not understanding. It's not about trying harder, it's about trusting deeper. It's not about figuring it out, it's about faithing it out. When you let go, you let God be God. And that's when you see him do the unthinkable, the unimaginable, the impossible. Because he's still the God who opens seas, who shuts lions' mouths, who brings dead things back to life. He's still the God who specializes in situations that look too far gone, but he's waiting for you to take your hands off so he can put his hands on. The impossible happens when you release it. Not before, not during, but the moment you let it go. The moment you stop saying what if and start saying even if. The moment you stop clinging to your plan and start clinging to his promise, because once you release it, you position yourself for resurrection, restoration, and revelation that only God can bring.